gracious and loving God. And the thoughts that you put on my heart, the right words that we should repeat. On the first Sunday in July, back in 2017, I preached my first service as a supply pastor to the Onativia United Methodist Church. I knew where the church was. Sharon and I had been by it several times in the past, but I didn't know who the congregation was, and I had no idea what they might expect from a pastor. The district superintendent, Noel Anderson, had called me earlier the week before to ask if I would lead worship there for 2 weeks while she was on a trip to South Korea. When she returned, she would introduce me as their new pastor if things went well. My lack of experience with this church helped me to develop a beginner's sermon that was intended to introduce me to them so that together we might be able to craft a pastor and parish relationship that would serve both of us well. The assignment to Onatipia was part of my practical program at Colgate Rochester Crozier Divinity School. My professor there, who led our class, had suggested when she found out what I was doing that I take Jesus' words from Luke chapter 4:24 to heart. Jesus said, "I assure you that no prophet is welcome in the prophet's hometown." What she really wanted me to do is to understand that how I would serve my time in a local church that I didn't know anything about. The point was, while I didn't know the congregation, they also didn't know who I was or what to expect during this first encounter. Now, I'm no prophet, but I do think that experience of changing churches and coming to a new church without knowing many people is an important part of the growing of a pastor in our United Methodist tradition. That's not the case for either Jeremiah in our Old Testament or Jesus in our New Testament. Both of them are hometown boys who went back home to deliver their first sermons. Jeremiah is one of my favorite prophets, just because he was that hometown guy. God chose him for a very difficult task. He was to warn Judah's leaders that the conditions in Jerusalem were about to go from very bad, they were in the midst of a siege, to much worse, because they would go into exile in Babylon. God chooses Jeremiah before he is born, according to verse 5. "Before I formed you in the womb, I knew you, and before you were born, I consecrated you. I appointed you a prophet to the nations." From these words, we can understand that God will call whoever he pleases, whenever he pleases. He even calls those who are unable to respond to that call. Later, Jeremiah will answer the call. That was later when he realized what he was up against. But God didn't change his mind. Jeremiah was his chosen prophet, and the call would stand. There are two parts to his mission. First, he will announce God's judgment upon the nations and the kingdoms, emphasized by those four verbs: pluck up, pull down, destroy, and overthrow. Words of destruction. And the second part, he will proclaim a new beginning, captured by these two opposite verbs, build and plant. These 6 verbs will reoccur in a variety of combinations throughout the book of Jeremiah. This agricultural metaphor of tilling and replanting is the main thesis of the book, making verse 10 the key verse to understand the progression of Jeremiah's call. Okay, so Jesus doesn't receive a call from God. He is God. But he's also the son of Joseph and Mary from Nazareth. And from the villager's perspective, he's the local kid who came back home. William Wilmot offers this illustration to explain what Jesus may have been facing. It is an illustration for getting the audience to pay attention. Wilmot writes, "A friend of mine returned from an audience with His Holiness the Dalai Lama. When His Holiness speaks, my friend said, everyone in the room becomes quiet, serene, and peaceful. Everyone pays attention to those from whom we expect there to come knowledge." This wasn't the case with Jesus. Things were fine at first, until he opened his mouth and the wheels came off for the audience. And this was his first sermon. One might have thought that Jesus would have used a more effective rhetorical strategy, would have saved some of the inflammatory speech until he had taken time to build some trust, to win people's affection, to contextualize his message, as they are urged to do in any homiletics class. No, instead he threw the book at them, hit them right between the eyes with Isaiah, and jabbed them with 1 Kings, right to the face, left hook. Beaten but not bowed, the congregation struggles to its feet, regroups, and attempts to throw the new preacher off the cliff. And Jesus went on his way. Everything was going so well. Jesus made his proclamation, preached his 9-word sermon, and the applause rained down. Well, that's not the whole story. At the end of the service, Jesus was rejected. They said he's just a hometown boy, getting a little too big for his britches. Look again at verse 22. All spoke well of him, and were amazed at the gracious words that came from his mouth. They thought, wow, he's a hometown boy. He's made good. He's one of us. He's ours. Aren't we special? Aren't we cool? That little phrase at the end of verse 22 wasn't disparaging. It was proud. He's like us. If Jesus had stopped there, it would have been a glorious homecoming. They would have slapped him on the back, invited him to dinner, and talked about the good old days when he was a boy. And things were so much better in Nazareth than in the Nazareth that used to be once upon a time. Jesus would have been a minor celebrity. And they all waved to him in the Walgreens parking lot and wanted to sit by him in the bleachers of the high school basketball games. He could have done well back there in his hometown. But Jesus doesn't stop talking. He has a bigger vision than just the small hometown on the hill country of Galilee. So he says, I know you want me to settle down here, because here's where all the people that matter are. I know you don't understand why anyone would want to leave Nazareth and go to other towns and other countries. But you don't need me here. You won't hear me here. He says those things are similar things in verses 23 to 24. Jesus continued, no prophet is accepted in the prophet's hometown. Now, different translations present these words in different ways. But what does Jesus mean? Why did he say that? Because he knew what was underneath the congregation's approval. And he knew they didn't want to hear what he came to say. Jesus came to say they were important. That's the book they heard. But God is going to get the kingdom going right here in Nazareth.